So our agenda is we'll do a little bit of an introduction, just hear a little bit from each of us. And then Samantha's going to be talking about the basics of peer support, some background information. Then I'm going to talk about the role of peer responders and ethics. Pat's going to talk about communication skills. Then we'll take a break. Then we'll talk skills for providing emotional support, how to be a good listener, how to be there for people. We'll do some role play of that in breakout groups. Then we're going to talk about problem solving, a simple model of problem solving that some of you are familiar with, just as a way of helping people see their way clear to making some progress with some of the things that they may bring to a peer support interaction. We'll role play that again, and then Sage and you all are going to go over the protocol, and we have in that section also information on how to deal with sort of crisis situations, and Pat and all of us are going to talk about that. So Sage, Samantha, Pat, any comments on that or modifications, things that I overlooked? If not, let's go to the next slide. Samantha, this is the introduction. That's the three of us. I'm Ed Fisher. I'm a professor in the School of Public Health, and I'm the head of Peers for Progress, which I've been doing for 10 years, and proud former teacher of Sage, Gray, and Nia. I don't think any of the rest of you have been in any of my classes. Well, Samantha has. Pat, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Patrick Tang. I'm a program manager at Peers for Progress, and yeah, excited to be here with you.
Samantha?
Hi all, I'm Samantha Liu. I also am on staff at Peers for Progress, and also went through UNC a couple rounds for my degrees. Yeah, so we'll just kind of kick off with some basics. This will be very review for those of you who took Ed's course in the past, but just want to establish the importance of peer support and why we're using it the ways that we are. And so peer support is really rooted in the fundamental role of social connections and support. You'll see on the left the image from the Harlow studies covered in every Psych 101 course around how monkeys really preferred this furred mother that was more like them and that was comforting to them over even the one who gave them sustenance. And so humans, we are similarly more effective and happier when we're able to talk to other people, especially those who we feel care about us and who we feel can help us and who we can go to for help, be a little bit vulnerable as well. This is super important, as most of you pointed out right now, especially with so many people being more isolated with social distancing measures. And so what you all are focusing on with peer-to-peer is very much mental health and mental wellness. But it's important also to know that social isolation can have impacts on your physical health. One of the really big findings that's often cited is around the risk of death associated with social isolation being greater than that as associated with cigarette smoking. So that's just some very broad strokes as to why social connections and social support are so important to our own well-being. Ed, it looked like you might wanted to add something there.
No, I'm
okay.
sorry.
No, you're fine. Great. So defining peer support very broadly are natural helpers, and we often use the word layperson, but really it's a spectrum. It can be someone who is a layperson with not as much training, all the way through people who have 40 hours of training and clinical contacts and who are Medicaid reimbursed as peer supporters. But the main thing is that peers are not professionals, they're not medical professionals, and that their value is really in being able to share their lived experiences with other people. That term lived experiences is something that you all also use on your website to define what you're doing with peer support. And in the mental health space, that usually means people with a shared mental health diagnosis and living with that diagnosis. Other ways that that's also defined in the peer support space might be a shared identity. So for example, if you're connecting to someone who's also a UNC student, and so connecting on that point as well. Peer support, we've seen it be really successful across a number of modalities. You all will be focused mostly on one-to-one, telephone, Zoom, and email, but also text messages are really useful, as well as groups. And the big thing is that peers are trusted because they are like someone. When you're talking to a professional, whether that be a counselor, a therapist, or a doctor, the relationship can be a little more distant, and it's a little more difficult to build that trust, whereas you all as peers can build that rapport a little more easily. This graph just really briefly shows the growth of peer support in the published literature from 2005 to 2018, and how it's just become a really popular strategy in different parts of healthcare. And then these are just some screenshots of slides from our work for Peers for Progress, and in general, we've just found that it works across a number of different topics: mental health, physical health, including cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. Peer support, good quality peer support works and is really useful in improving health outcomes. So these are what we call the 5 key functions at Peers for Progress. These key functions are what we've observed to be just really important characteristics of high quality peer support. So social emotional support in green down at the bottom is referring to what you all will be doing with providing good communication, good listening, building rapport, and also empathizing with the people who you're talking to. And then moving to the orange one, assistance in daily management, is also really important for you all. That might mean sharing tips and tricks that you've learned along the way to help manage your mental well-being. It is really important, as I said earlier in the definition of a peer supporter, that you're not giving medical advice when you're helping with this daily management. And we'll talk a little more about that later. In the red on the top is being there. That is speaking to peer supporters just being available, much more available than a clinical provider most of the time, in that someone who's calling in might, text you a question or want to call you without, scheduling an appointment weeks in advance. Ongoing support also speaks to being able to talk to someone long-term. We don't usually see that peer support is as successful whenever you have just a one-touch with someone, meaning that you only talk to them once and then you're done. Usually it's part of building a longer relationship, and both the ongoing support and being there both speak to follow-up and how important that is as a peer supporter. We'll touch on more of that later as well. And then the last one on the bottom in blue is the linkage to clinical and community resources. This doesn't mean that you need to know every phone number and website for every single resource. It just means that you as a peer supporter have some at your disposal, some key resources, hotlines, but that you have the time and that you have the skills to be able to sit down with someone and help them find the resources that they need. So don't feel pressured to just know everything straight off the bat. Be able to take someone's needs and to sit them down and calmly say, okay, we can help you find that. Let's sit down and Google that and find what's most appropriate for you. So that is really broad and quick overview of peer support basics and kind of our key findings within Peers for Progress. And we'll elaborate on these as we go on throughout the morning.
Great, thanks, Samantha. And I'm going to now talk a little bit more about the role of peer responders and ethics, delve into a little bit more of the specifics of what you all might be doing. Let me start off by emphasizing something that we found very helpful, which is that peer supporters are friends with training. Rather than professionals, they're not highly skilled counselors. Their role is not to explore deep aspects of people's history or experience, but rather to be more like a friend who's had some training in how to be helpful to people who are going through one or another types of difficulties, like those that you all mentioned in the introduction, being new in an area, being an international student new to US culture, or having some bumps in the road during your in school, etc. So we'll come back to that. Next slide. So the guiding principles are that your effectiveness doesn't come from being an expert. As Samantha mentioned, you're not going to be expected to give medical or, or expert advice in any area. It's not your job to know what the requirements are of a student's major. It's not your job to know what people need to do to register for a particular program. You're responsible for being a friend with some experience. It's not therapy. It's, however, can be very, very helpful to people in feeling supported, feeling understood, and feeling helped in finding a way to solve some of the problems that they're finding difficult. The assumption is that people are capable of solving their own problems, but sometimes a little practical advice or help or a little bit of just being there for people can help them realize their ability to solve their own problems. Next. So what you do, you talk with and listen to callers, and probably the most important word in this whole slide is listen. Talking with and listening people, listening deeply, not jumping to conclusions, just letting people know that they've been heard. You all have had the experience of feeling upset by something and feeling how good it is for someone to just listen to you and to hear you out and to respond with compassion and with validating that what you're doing is okay. They also assist in problem solving. We'll get back to that later. Discuss follow-up and further contact. They rally support. I forgot to ask, what's an IRL?
In real life.
I'm sorry?
It's short for in real life. So
okay.
The program's mostly digital, remote, and in real life is more, your real contact, yeah.
Okay. Every day. Yeah, peer support are both as a source of support themselves, but also helps people rally support among their friends and neighbors and family members, classmates, etc. And advise and refer to appropriate resources. So the peer supporter doesn't necessarily need to know who your academic advisor is, but they can help you recognize that this is something that you need to talk to your advisor about, or something, other resources, including, for instance, CAPS on the UNC campus. Next. So what's expected of peer supporters is to be available and helpful to talk about concerns, to be respectful of privacy as you would be in any relationship. You're respecting the confidence that people are sharing with you. Respect individual differences. Obviously, we're all have all sorts of different perspectives, the circumstances, identities, etc., and communicating respect for that is important. Sorry, that's a colleague from China. To be available is reasonable. As you would for a friend, you would be available to them if they're going through some rough sledding. That doesn't mean that you have to not go to any classes this week because your friend is dealing with something difficult. So be available is reasonable. Recognize when issues are outside of your comfort zone, and there's going to be a I forget the term, the program exec. Is that the term, Sage?
Yep, that's correct.
So if you get into something that you're not sure how to deal with, contact the exec. Turn to others as necessary, same thing. We'll probably have periodic meetings of the peer supporters in the program, and it would be important for you to participate in those, learn more skills, share experiences, share tips with each other, and then coming back finally to what I mentioned at the outset, that what you are, friends with additional training, not experts, not academic advisors, not professors, not job supervisors, not mental health counselors. Next. So best practices as a peer supporter, build rapport and trust. That's sort of number one. Number two, number three. You don't have to rush to solve a problem. You can take time to get to know somebody, sort of proceed at their pace. And you'll find that when you've developed some rapport and the person feels comfortable with you, then you're going to be able to be a lot more helpful to them than if you immediately jump in with what you think is a brilliant solution to their problem. Demonstrate empathy, and Pat's going to talk about some communication skills for doing that, but basically it's being open to their experience and trying to understand things as they are experiencing them. Normalize their experience, and maybe the biggest part of normalizing their experience is empathizing with it in the first place. It's when we have something that is bothering us and we think it's horrible and we think it's crazy and that nobody else ever has felt this way in the entirety of human experience. When we talk to somebody about it and they respond, not necessarily by telling us that they've had the same experience, but they just respond by indicating that this is understandable, this is what happens to people. That's very helpful to us. Keep the contact light and non-demanding. Don't be overly ponderous. We'll talk a little bit later about sometimes using humor, and show sensitivity. Be sensitive to what's going on with the person. Next. Along those same lines, meet people where they're at. Not everyone is ready for changes. Some just want to talk with someone who understands. We'll talk a little bit more about the complications of that. Start small and celebrate small wins. Helping people just maybe do one thing to make their circumstances better. That can be a really big step for the individual. Help them see their issues from another point of view. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And remember that social support develops over time, that you can't be as supportive as you'd like to be just by immediately saying, "Hi, my name is Ed." It takes some time to develop that rapport. Next. We've talked about this before. Don't worry about always knowing the right thing to say. You don't have to have the right thing to say. If you're not sure what to say, "Gee, it's really complicated what you're describing to me. I'm not sure what to say right now." Acknowledge boundaries and be respectful of boundaries. You're not going, although we say that the peer supporter is like a friend with training, you're not going to become their friend. You're not going to become their classmate. And if appropriate, follow up on doctor's visits and referrals. That is, you follow up and talk to them. How did that go? Were you able to get an appointment at CAPS? Was your advisor helpful? And then working together with other peer responders. We talked a little bit a minute ago about having meetings for group supervision and things of that nature. And again, use backup and trusted the peer-to-peer exec is going to be an important person for you. Next. So an important point in all of peer support is positionality. It includes obviously racism, which we're all concerned about these days, but it includes everything we do. So if you're a fourth-year student providing support to a first-year student, there's a positionality in that. If you're an English Lit major supporting somebody who's a pre-med, there's positionality in that. And of course, if you're white, providing support to someone of color or from another culture or an African American, there's positionality in that. And so being sensitive to positionality and recognizing it, recognizing that it's always in one way or another present in a relationship is important. And there is a resource here for inclusive excellence training from the School of Public Health. There are many others on campus as well, and there'll be more on that in the future. Next slide. Communication skills. Pat, I think we're turning it over to you at this point.
All right. Thanks, Ed. Samantha, can we go to the next slide? So for this section, you know, a lot of you all are here today to build on your existing communication skills. You know, what I'm going to talk about in this next section is not going to be brand new for, you know, most people. You will have heard of these things before. So this is, think of this as a reminder of these things, putting a concrete name on these skills and trying to do these things intentionally when you're talking to somebody. So really it's just kind of reinforcing, reminding, and making these things concrete and intentional. The thing that I think all of this builds off of is active listening. So we're gonna just center our discussion today around active listening, and you'll see that a lot of the other sections and skills will really play off of active listening skills. So quickly, definition of active listening, it is making a conscious effort to understand the complete message that someone is sending to you. So not just what explicitly they're saying in the content of the message, but also the tone and things that are unsaid in the emotions and the feelings that are behind that message. And then also, how do you then respond to what's being said in a way that's non-judgmental and that demonstrates empathy? Because, you know, we can feel empathetic towards somebody, but how do you verbalize that? And how do you do that over a medium where, you know, you're unable to maybe make eye contact with somebody or use a lot of those nonverbal cues to show that you're listening and being empathetic? Next slide, please. So, you know, one of the things to remember is that anyone can be trained to be a good listener. You know, this is not some type of specialized knowledge that certain people have. We can all develop this trait or this skill. The first thing that we're starting off with is just to create a safe space for people to share emotions. So let people know that, you know, there's no judgment, that they can freely express what they're feeling without being cut off, without being you know, argued against, that it is a space where they can feel comfortable saying what they really feel. The third point being really sincerely interested in what the other person is talking about. I think that's something that you have to flip on when you're engaging with somebody. Even, I mean, that can be hard sometimes if it's not something that you're personally interested in. But, you know, how do you, if you really care about that person's best interest, I think if you come in with that frame of mind, then that sincerity will flip on. Part of active listening is to be aware of your judgments, your opinions, your feelings, but to avoid conveying them to the other person. I mentioned the last point on the previous slide, but just to reemphasize, just think about, try to feel what is not being said and what can't be said in relation to what's being spoken. Next slide, please. So if you look online, there are lots of different steps or how people have outlined active listening. There's 4 steps to active listening, 10 steps to active listening. You know, we're not going with some universal set of rules for active listening. We've outlined just 5 simple ones here. Just at the start, stop all the other things you're doing. So, you know, maybe not like taking a class on Zoom or being in a Zoom meeting where you're maybe multitasking and reading emails on another screen. Really, if you're talking with someone, that should be the only thing that you're doing. Unless the other thing is, you know, maybe taking notes on the conversation. Second step, focus on feelings and emotions. So this step is really just validating and acknowledging that other person's experiences. Third is making reflections. So this is a special skill where if someone says something, you can paraphrase what they said and just kind of reflect it back to them, and that will help them feel that they're being understood and confirm that you guys are on the same page. I have a slide on that coming up. Number 4 is asking open-ended questions. You know, if you've, one of my experiences is that, you know, people have said that, you know, Pat, you're a pretty good listener, and I'm like, yeah, what do you mean by I'm a good listener? They say you ask really good questions. So, you know, is the question relevant to what that person said, or is it completely, you know, it's kind of a formulaic question, right? You're going down like a list, asking clinical questions, and it doesn't really kind of continue the conversation where the person left off. So really asking a good question is being sensitive to what the person has just said. And I think the last one, number 5 here, is not to interrupt the caller as they're speaking. And even if there is a pause when the caller, you know, has stopped speaking, you don't have to immediately, you know, kind of fill that space with something yourself. You can kind of let the caller think about what they want to say next. Next slide, please. So a little more on making reflections. So this is part of validating the speaker's experience, and reflections will often start with, so it sounds like, if I'm hearing you correctly, I hear you saying, so, you know, that is an easy way to just in one sentence. And sometimes it's hard to reflect, you know, if someone's talking for like 5 minutes and then you're reflecting kind of the key point that you've heard, or the key feeling that you felt in like a sentence or two. That can be challenging, but it can really make them feel like you understood what they were trying to say. Next slide, please. Using open-ended questions. So just defining that a little bit further. You guys are probably familiar. These open-ended questions are ones that can't be answered by a simple yes or no. Although, you know, a lot of people, even if you ask a closed-ended question, they might expand upon that themselves, right? They'll say yes and no, but. So, you know, it kind of depends on the person you're talking to. Sometimes closed-ended questions are fine to keep the conversation going, but below are some examples. If you're finding yourself asking a lot of closed-ended questions and it's having a hard time stimulating thinking and conversation, you can start off your questions with, you know, to what extent, help me understand, asking what and why questions, and you know, the most simple is tell me more about that. All right, next slide, please. So I just want to throw this out to the entire group before we you know, go into smaller role plays later on, so people don't have to feel like they're put on the spot. But you can volunteer. If someone, you know, said this to you in the course of a call, how might you respond to it? And you can think of the various things that I talked about in active listening. You can reflect on this. You can ask an open-ended question. If someone said, I feel like I'm always struggling and no one in my life understands how hard it is. Any volunteers for a simple response that you might say in response? You know, something that doesn't have to solve the problem. It doesn't have to be complicated.
Sure. You could ask more of an open-ended question on, like, what does when I hear you say that you're struggling, you know, what does that mean to you? Can you give me an example of ways you're struggling?
Great. Yeah, exactly. So asking them for a little bit more specific, right, to expand upon what specifically are they struggling with. Yep. And there's two pieces there too, right? The first part is what are you struggling with? Tell me more about that. And then the other part is, so it sounds like you don't have other people to talk to about that, or tell me more about that. A very simple response is to reflect the difficulty of the situation. So usually it's at the end of the sentence here, and you just say, I know it can be hard sometimes, right? That's the difficulty they've expressed there. And another response might be, yeah, you want to talk about what's going on, and just, you know, just let them naturally kind of expand upon what they've just said. Okay. I got a next question.
Yeah, let me just comment, Pat. One way of thinking about to be very curious, not idly curious, like, oh, did you order a hamburger or a hot dog? But curious to try to understand what the person is meaning. So I see four things in there that I'd be really curious about. It's always struggling. I mean, we all have struggles at some time, but you're feeling you're always struggling. Tell me more about that. The second is struggling, is I think somebody mentioned, tell me more about what the problems are that you're struggling with. And then understands it seems so overwhelming to you, and it seems like people don't understand what it's like to you. It's so big in your mind and they're not seeing it. Tell me more about that. And then finally, no one. We don't expect everybody to understand us, but you're sitting here and you're feeling that there's nobody that you can turn to that understands. Tell me more about that. So those are four aspects of this that I think, each of them could generate a 5-minute conversation.
Thanks, Ed. So the next question here maybe is a little simpler than the previous one, with giving a lot that you can kind of probe on. If we go to the next slide, this one is a timely question. So if someone said, "I really hate being back on campus. I can't go anywhere without feeling on edge."
I think for this one, it's the first thing would be to acknowledge the statement that they hate being back on campus by empathizing with that. Like, I'm sorry that being back on campus is causing you stress, or it's not as pleasant, but can you expand on why you feel on edge whenever you go on campus?
Great, yeah.
I think what you just did was important. Is we could all imagine why somebody might hate being back on campus, but don't assume you know why they hate being back on campus.
Yeah, I think for me, the first thing that came to my mind was responding with maybe sharing something that you felt as well, right? Just saying something like, yeah, it's really different around campus. It's really hard to adjust to what's going on.
You might also
Mm-hmm.
ask about, they're using the word hate. Everybody's fetching about being on campus, or got one thing or another that they're bothered by. We're all overwhelmed, but you really hate it. Tell me more about that.
I think with this one, I would also ask if you've been able to talk to anybody, or your roommate, depending if you're in dorms or something, but if you've been able to talk to anybody about how you're feeling, because I think this is going to be a very ubiquitous sort of, sentiment and idea.
Right. So helping them find supports, or identifying supports in their real life. Mm-hmm. And if there's an absence of that, helping them do something about it. Yeah.
That's Gray. I don't mean to be critical. That's a really good thing to do. But first you want to understand what they're feeling before you start into, raising questions about things they might do about it.
Oh, right, of course.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. That was number 2 on the active listening list, focus on feelings and emotions. So I could see also why, you immediately, felt, responding to the emotion of hate was really important in here to try to kind of pull that out a little bit. Okay, next slide. So one way to connect with people and to build rapport is storytelling. And I think this is something that folks can, you guys can practice this on your own, and we like to let us know how it goes. But if someone's calling in or you're calling somebody, how do you introduce yourself in a 30 seconds to a minute that lets them know who you are, how you can help them, and maybe something personal about yourself, and how do you craft your self-introduction, and then how do you tell your own story to people without kind of dominating the conversation. I know there are some people that feel comforted when they hear about other people's experiences. I think if they ask you about how you dealt with a situation or how you might do something, that's a great opportunity for you to kind of expand on your storytelling. But always ask yourself, how is sharing your story helping the caller or your relationship? And obviously, if someone is in distress, that's probably not a good time for telling your story, but really just sit there and listen. Next slide, please. Tones to avoid. I'm just going to name these quickly in order without going through them in too much detail. But telling people what to do, it can be really detrimental, threatening them with negative outcomes. This is something that our parents' generation might do to us. So you don't want them to feel like they're being told that if they keep doing something, bad things will happen to them. Preaching, moralizing, I guess there. Criticizing, arguing with somebody. These are ways to kind of make the other person feel more entrenched in their existing positions. Changing the subject, diverting, one-upmanship. That's probably not going to be something that happens in this group, but there are people that they always have a better story to tell. And humor, that's one of the, I think probably the most subjective one in here. So this is like not making light of a person's situation, but it is okay to use humor to kind of release the tension of a situation, or kind of understanding that a situation is ironic, or the dark humor in something. That's definitely subjective and based on your relationship with that other person. Next slide, please. And I'll just end the section on communication with, well, I guess, tones to avoid was bad communication, but this is also, killer phrases that are bad for communications. So, saying things like, don't worry, things could be worse, think positively. And I think the last one on this slide, why don't you just, so, you're about to give somebody advice and you're saying, why don't you just do so-and-so? It oversimplifies their problem. And then also it sounds like you're kind of, dismissing what they've tried before. So
sometimes I think the worst word in any sort of counseling interaction is just. It never is good.
Mm-hmm.
So you're just feeling this. Why don't you just do that? They're just trying to do this. Go ahead.
Well, that was the end of the communication section. We have a short break scheduled in here. So building off of the communication skills that we talked about a little bit earlier, how do those translate into providing emotional support? Next slide. What makes people feel supported? So this is going to be very familiar to you. I mean, it's when people empathize with their experiences, takes a sincere, authentic interest in them. One thing that we might not think about is people feel supported when you recognize things that are happening to them, right? So, this might be something that it's not going to happen on one or two calls. And I think some of these suggestions do make the assumption that there will be repeat contacts between the peer responder and the person they're helping with. Some of these things that develop over time. So yeah, recognizing changes that are happening in their lives. So celebrating the good things, and then also if they bring up bad things, to really highlight that you've noticed. So for instance, like if you recognize someone's been maybe quote unquote not themselves, or being a little less talkative than usual. So if you picked up on that, you can ask about it. And I think very importantly, the last two items on here is maybe being proactive in reaching out to check in on how things are going, and also being available and being there for them when it's most needed. So if they need someone to talk to urgently, are you there for them? That can really help them make them feel supported. Next slide. So one of our key functions is just being there. Sorry for using just, but it really is as simple as being there. So what does being there entail in concrete terms? I mean, first thing, it's reliability, right? So if you told somebody that you were going to call them on a certain day at a certain time or a time window, you got to show up and be there at that time. It means responding in a timely manner. This can be defined however your group wants to, but if, for instance, if they send you an email or a text message, they're not waiting 2-3 days before they get a response from you, and it might just be a response like, "Hey, I'm super busy right now. Can I get back to you, tomorrow?" So just making sure that you haven't left their message unread. Lastly, we talked about not interrupting people. So this is, some people, if they're talkative, maybe you find that the conversation's going on for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and this is, your time is important as well, and you probably didn't sign up to have 2-3 hour conversations with people. So how do you end that conversation without cutting it off? Like, an hour's coming up, like this is all the time I've scheduled today, but so, you can let them know that, oh, I have something else that I got to get to in 20 minutes. Is that okay? If we have more stuff to talk about, we can, follow up on it next time or soon, but letting them know that you have to get off at a certain time ahead of when that's actually coming up. Next slide, please.
I had a quick question about that.
Sure.
I'm not sure how much, I'm personally unfamiliar with this shorter just style of peer support. So is it better to perhaps make those expectations clear beforehand? So like when you pick up the call, say, "It's so great to meet you. I have a thing in an hour and a half." Does that make sense? I'm just not sure how to manage the amount of time that we have, just because it is so varied and so short sometimes.
Right. Yeah, and that's that is something that maybe goes into the self-introduction So as you're introducing yourself and kind of what the peer responder does, kind of, yeah, making, letting them know what they can expect from the call. You can kind of build it in there into the introduction. Yes, I mean, I think it's setting a time limit ahead of time. Yeah, I'd like to hear what other people think about that.
Sometimes we, when we're nervous about something, we try to say it too quickly, and that makes it worse. So if you have to get off the phone in a half hour, when you begin the conversation, you might be out of nervousness, say, I have to get off in a half hour. And then the person feels like, oh, I'm being limited. So a term that's frequently used in the field is I language. So talk about yourself. I really want to make sure that I don't leave you feeling, that we have to stop in the middle of something important. So I do want to let you know that I have to get off in a half hour today. So if we have to stop and schedule another time, but I want to make sure that I don't leave you shortchanged. So just talking more about your circumstance and your feelings regarding the thing that's making you a little anxious will be helpful to the person.
On a related note, yeah, setting that up ahead of time makes wrapping up the call a lot easier too. So sometimes it's hard to end a conversation or knowing the right time to end a conversation. It seems like it might happen naturally if the topics of discussion have been exhausted. But how do you wrap up and say, okay, so yeah, today we talked about this, and for next time, let's keep talking about this, or you mentioned you try this, and we'll let me know how that goes. So kind of that wrap up is also something that might be helpful if there's kind of an end time.
I think, however, most calls will probably go maybe 20, maybe 30 minutes. That's an average we see in lots of these kinds of interactions. So, unless you know something ahead of time that the person has got something really troubling them to talk about, or if, for instance, your circumstances is unusual that you only have 10 minutes. Otherwise, I think you can sort of leave that unstated and assume sort of common expectations. If it becomes clear that the person needs to talk longer, then when it becomes clear, you can sort of say, I just want you to know I don't want you to feel cut off, but I am going to need to get off in 20 minutes, but we can talk another time and make sure we arrange a plan for that.
Thank you, Ed. All right. So going from just being there, let's talk about being on their side. So being an ally to the caller. And I think that's what callers are going to be looking for, is someone who can help them face a problem together, right? One thing that's important is, sometimes when a participant joins a program, they're not ready to buy in immediately right at the start. You kind of have to convince them that you're on their side, and that also you don't have some sort of a hidden agenda. So you might see this with kind of clinically led programs where it's like, oh, is this because the community health center or the hospital wants to improve their scores or something, that they're doing this sort of program? What are they actually trying to do? What's the agenda of the program and of the people running it? But as long as, you know, it's very clear that, you know, whatever the caller is looking for, that is your focus. I don't think there'll be a problem with that. And the last one here is just a reminder that being on their side means not putting them on the defensive. I mentioned that earlier under communication skills. Next slide. So providing encouragement, I thought this ties in well to active listening, and particularly the making affirmations. That was something I didn't stress earlier about active listening, but affirming somebody is when you provide them encouragement based on something that they've done mostly, or what they said. So statements like, it's really good to hear that, or I'm glad you asked that, that's a great question. And then supportive, encouraging statements like, I think you're on the right track with that, I think that's a great plan. And it seems like you've thought a lot about this. These can all be really encouraging statements and affirming them. Next slide. And just around to wrap up this discussion on emotional support, on how do you respond to negative emotions. So these are kind of the steps that you can take when responding to somebody's negative emotions. So the first one, as always, is recognizing those feelings. Second is to affirm the individual's involvement. So the previous slide, affirming that it's great that you're, or it seems like you've been working on that, a statement kind of like that they are involved in it, and then try to redirect it to something that's helpful. Obviously giving them a chance to express their negative emotions, but then at some point redirecting it to something that they can do possibly about it later on.
So I'm going to be fairly quick on problem solving because I think we've covered a lot of it. The next slide. Let's skip over this. Or no, I'm sorry, go back to that. No, back to the previous. So just to be aware of the variety of problems that people may be calling for, stress, loneliness, uncertainty, some of the things we imagine about, or interpersonal conflicts. Was listed here. I think each of them may be exacerbated by COVID. For instance, if a student's parent has been furloughed and the family is having financial problems, that's going to be experienced by the student. Resource availability is a big issue these days. So I think we just need to be aware of the variety of problems we may see. Next slide. Next slide. So what I want to describe to you is a simple three-step approach to problem solving. This came out of what's referred to as a friendship bench program in Africa. And I think it's a really good model. So the first part of problem solving is validating and endorsing the person's feelings and using active listening and empathic statements, all the things we've been talking about so far in this training. And I want to emphasize again that really make sure that you give this first step as much room as it needs. A common mistake is to sort of move too quickly to trying to solve the problem. And you want to, when the person sort of feels like, okay, I've said it, you've understood it, that felt good, that's when to move to problem solving. And you'll know it when you see it. The second step is to raise the possibility of doing something. And this is really important. We tend to say, okay, I think we understand your problem. Let's now talk about how we're going to solve it, making the assumption that the person is ready to solve it. That's probably a mistake. Sometimes people aren't ready to solve the problem. They're just overwhelmed by it, and still they're going to feel good about the fact that you've heard them and understood them, but they may not be ready to solve or to do anything concrete about it. So we need to make that explicit and ask them whether they are ready to begin talking about changing something, either in the situation or in their own reaction to it. Maybe they want to try to change something in the situation. Maybe they say, well, I realize I'm overreacting to things. I need to not jump to conclusions or something. So here are some possible probes. Maybe it's too soon to worry about fixing it, but have you thought about dealing with it? How have you dealt with things like this before? Those are ways of exploring whether the individual is ready to move on to solving the problem. And then if they are, then you can brainstorm. You can ask things like, how do you think you want to handle it? What will it require? What are the pros and cons of doing one thing or the other? In the previous area, but it sort of fits here better. How have you done things like this before? What have you, if the individual is saying, you know, I just don't know how to figure out whether I want to major in poli-sci or sociology, ask them how they've solved other problems in the past and whether they can learn from themselves about how they do a good job of solving problems. So that's how you begin brainstorming the problems. The next slide. And this is just that it's the friendship bench model. Next slide.
Yeah, Samantha, could you go to the next slide? So this is more about like a more tangible approach of like, what are we going to be doing? And so we're hoping that once school starts and once we get our outreach more established, we'll start having callers during the month of August and onwards. And so what happens when you're requested by a peer? So we mentioned they'll fill out a form and we will get a response. And we will notify you as a peer responder with the contact information. And we'll have a spreadsheet with your name and the date at which the peer responder requested you. And we're asking that within 48 hours, you reach out to the person and you have to change the box of which is prior to red to green. So we know that within 48 hours you have contacted the peer responder, and we'll share the sheet with you in the coming weeks. And then, so once again, the responsibility is on the peer responder to contact the peer, just so that you guys know your own schedules better on a week-to-week basis, and it might be easier just for the two of you to figure out a time and a way to kind of communicate. And so it's either going to be over Google Voice, Zoom, or email. And so all of those could be anonymous. You can change your name on Zoom. Google Voice is especially important, just so that you don't get calls at odd hours of the night if you know, to your direct line or direct phone if you do end up using Google Voice or text through Google Voice. So We requested you guys to create a Google Voice number. If there are any issues or anything of that sort, feel free to reach out and we can help you. But we're hoping that everyone has created a Google Voice number.
On to the next slide. Oh, so okay. So for the post-call checklist, so back on that same survey sheet that was just talked about, there's going to be a second tab, basically like a post-call checklist, and where you just initial your name, like shown in the picture below, after you finish the assigned call. So the P2P exec team can send out a survey to the peer respondee, just like asking like how they heard about us, was this like a good match, and like how safe they felt with you, and like et cetera, and like if they'll be coming back. And yeah, basically there's going to be weekly check-ins where we can talk about like improvements or suggestions about a topic that we can discuss. And yeah, that's basically it. And we want you to make sure that you take care of yourself, like you leave a peer-to-peer life aside also from your social life or like a private life, and stuff like that.
Yeah, so we just wanted to finish with peer responder well-being. We want to emphasize that we want to make sure that all of you aren't overwhelmed or have too much going on. In addition to this is something you're doing as a volunteer thing, so we totally acknowledge that you have other responsibilities. So please feel free to communicate with us if you ever feel like you have too much going on, you need to take a step back. We are very flexible in that way. We also want to encourage you to, if you ever need peer support, to use the same resources that we're offering, or the resources that they had on the last slide. We also want to make sure that you're taking time for yourself outside of calls, and you're able to separate your P2P work from your daily living and for your own mental health. And then, as I said, we also want to emphasize communication between exec and peer responders. We're here to support you, just like you're here to support others. So we want, if possible, to eventually have weekly or bi-weekly check-ins, depending on what our call volume is, to allow us all to debrief, catch up, or discuss interactions or calls that you had during that week. So that way we can all stay on the same page and be there for each other. But yeah, I think that's it. If you want to go to the next slide, Samantha. In closing, I want to say a huge thanks to Peer2Progress for doing this training. This is incredibly thorough and insanely well put together. We'll also, as Samantha said, send out this slide afterwards in an email, so you can always refer back to this. And again, thank you everyone for coming during your Sunday morning and giving us 2 hours of your time. I'm sorry we went a little bit over, but yeah, we really appreciate everyone coming.